Hi guys, welcome. You guys had a good week. Sarah, are you here yet?
Yes, I am. We were just in a lecture there before, and poor Fahd is just running a little bit over time. But most of the students have come across to the tutorial now, I think. Luke?
Good. Well, if you want to, I don't know if you had a chance to talk about honours during the lecture, or if you want to do that now.
Yes, I might actually take the opportunity and do that now quickly, Luke.
Yep.
So students who are interested in honours projects for the coming session or next year, you should start approaching the various academics now. We're also in the Neuroscience Research Unit offering various types of projects in the area of anxiety and depression, as well as cognitive functioning, sleepiness, sleep and fatigue, and so forth. We also have multiple projects with Royal North Shore Hospital in the area of diabetes that Professor Anne Simpson and also Dr. Naja Nassif join on my projects. So if you're interested, please start contacting the various academics and myself. I should also point out, we've had some very good students go through our honours project onto PhDs in the future as well, or medicine, etc. And some of them you're already knowing. Luke is there right in front of you. He has finished his honours with a first class honours, and he went on to do his PhD. I'm hoping he'll become an academic one day. And then we've also got Taryn Chalmers, as you all know. She's also finished her honours with a first class honours with me and went on to do medicine. And we've got many such cases for some of you who might know people like Jamin Elliott and Ty Lees and many more. Now, our projects are very human oriented in the sense of we actually conduct human-based research. We actually are dealing with people to collect data, which is medical physiological data or psychometric data in the lab. And I lead the Neuroscience Research Unit. And if you're interested in any of these projects, please start contacting myself or other academics. There's many projects for offer in the school by the various academics, including microbiology, molecular biology, human research, as well as Tamara Stinder's facial image recognition research and so forth. So I hope that some of you are thinking and contemplating the future into honours. Anyway, good luck for the rest of the session and enjoy today's tutorial by Luke. I'll pipe in when I need to. Thanks, you.
Sarah. I'll just add that honours is a really good it's a good step if you're going into medicine, for example, because it can really help boost your GPA. It's really good if you want to get into any kind of like academic work, any kind of research. It's just almost a necessary step for you. And the fact that we get to do human-based research within our unit, we're one of the very few units within science at UTS that actually has like human contact. Just to make it a little bit more interesting, and we certainly really enjoy being able to work with other people. And yeah, at this point, guys, if you just all you really need to be doing at this stage, if you are even remotely interested, is just send Sarah an email or any number of the other academics you're in contact with. Send them an email and just say, look, I'm interested in honours. I have no idea what kind of project I want to be doing, but I think that you might be able to tell me more, or you might have a project in the area that I'm interested in. At this stage, you don't have to have anything decided, and right up until like the first couple of months of your actual honours year, your project can still be changing and that kind of thing. So there's really no pressure on you guys at this point, other than to just get in early and find out, you know, just general, if this is something that you're interested in. But
don't leave it too late in case you want to go with particular academics. They won't obviously take 10 or 20 of students. Usually they will try to pick one or two, perhaps a few more in certain groups. But yeah, try to get in early if you're really interested in particular topics and projects of particular academics. Thanks again, Luke. Yep.
All right, awesome. Let's get started on this week's tutorial then. So schizophrenia, you had a little bit on this already in your lecture when you did mental illnesses. So you guys have already looked at anxiety and depression in your lecture and with me in my tutorial. And this is the last of the mental illnesses that we're going to cover in tutorials. And just as kind of a introduction, obviously we've got this introductory slide, but to try to get you guys think a bit differently about schizophrenia, it's not like anxiety and depression. Those are sort of extreme manifestations of something that you can already experience on a daily basis. So it's possible to experience healthy levels of anxiety. It's possible to experience healthy levels of some of the things that are characteristic of depression, like a lack of motivation or fatigue or insomnia. You can have, you know, every now and then you might just have trouble falling to sleep. That doesn't mean you have depression. But it's kind of easy for the average person to think of what chronic anxiety might be or chronic depression might be, because you can experience them on a day-to-day basis. Schizophrenia is not like that. It is so far outside what you can imagine the experience is like that it's kind of in its own realm in terms of a mental illness. And we are really trying to start to think of it as a like umbrella term, because the range of like symptoms and the range of the syndrome is just so huge. So we have different like subtypes of schizophrenia, and it's helpful to think of them like that, because that can help with treatment. Because if we just try to treat everyone with schizophrenia with the same, you know, treatment, that's not going to work, because they are very nuanced individual cases. So that's just one way for you guys to try to think about it. Schizophrenia affects about 1%. Yeah, I've seen varyingly different numbers of the incidence of schizophrenia, but 1% of the general population is what we usually stick to in this subject. And it's characterized by specific psychological manifestations, including hallucinations, delusions, and behavioral and thought disturbances. Again, you're going to find out in this tutorial that it's a lot more nuanced than that, but generally that's kind of what schizophrenia is. And Sarah just mentioned in the chat that schizophrenia means split mind, just as the like why it's named that way. There are a range of anatomical features as well, which we'll get into near the end of the tutorial. And it is a more accurate to think of as an umbrella term. Yep. Just because it's difficult to describe the average schizophrenia patient. So we're going to look at the 4 main biological perspectives of schizophrenia. So the first one, which you would have covered a little bit in the lecture, is the genetic, like what we characterize as the genetic biological factors. And so we have 4 of them we're going to look at, and then we have a number of other ones that we're going to look at as well. So the first one, familial association. I'm actually going to start the first poll here, guys. So I'm going to give you some time to answer that, but it is based on stuff that you would have already seen in the lecture. So if you can cast your mind back to the lecture, that's the wrong poll. I'm going to end that immediately. Genetic risk. All right, sorry guys. So the poll's there. I'm going to read out the question. Patient JS has recently been diagnosed with schizophrenia based purely on familial or genetic association. Which of the following of his relatives is most likely to also develop schizophrenia within their lifetime? So think about, cast your mind back to the schizophrenia lecture. There's a graph you guys might remember looking at. And that basically has your answer in it, but we're going to I'll show it in a second. We got 35% of you voted. Give you a bit longer. And just while we're waiting, I'm just going to read out this. So your risk of developing schizophrenia increases with the number of genes you share with a relative with schizophrenia. So one would think that if patient JS has schizophrenia, his relatives which share the most genes with him are the ones that are going to have the most risk of developing schizophrenia within their lifetime. A couple of other interesting things. If both your parents have schizophrenia, your lifetime risk of developing it as well is 4 times more likely than if you just had one parent. And finally, yeah, I'll get into that last point in a second because I'm going to show the graph. Going to end the poll there because almost all of you have voted. Share results. I'm going to need to do this because when I looked at the VOD, I saw that you guys couldn't see what was For those of you who saw the recorded one, you couldn't see the results. So hopefully you can see that now. So 2/3 of you thought that it was JS's sister that will have schizophrenia, and you would be correct. So you guys should remember this graph on the right from the lecture. The way to read it is, think of if you have schizophrenia, so your children will have a 13% risk of developing schizophrenia in their lifetime. If you have schizophrenia, your nieces and nephews will have a 4% chance of developing schizophrenia within their lifetime. That's kind of how to read that diagram. So identical twins have the highest chance. So if one twin develops it, there is almost a 50-50 chance of the other twin also developing it. This doesn't mean that identical twins in general just have a 50% chance of developing schizophrenia. It's nothing to do with that. It's just if one of you has it, what is the risk that someone who shares your genes also gets it?
Yeah, so the way to remember this would be, look at the question. It says based purely on genetic association. So the closer you're related, the higher the chances. Okay, so if you just remember that, and if you've got a combination of these type of things in an exam question, you'll be able to pick up the correct answer.
Cool. And the other thing to take away is that, so because identical twins have the exact same genetic composition, and they don't have a 100% chance of both developing schizophrenia if one develops it, that means that schizophrenia doesn't have a 100% genetic component. It's not purely genetics. There must be some other environmental things going on. So that was the first kind of thing that pops to mind when you think of familial association. And then we've also looked at twin studies for this as well. So this first point, fraternal twins are your dizygotic twins. So fraternal twins are basically just two siblings that come from the same womb and are just born at the same time. They have the same genetic similarities as regular twins. It's just, they're literally just two siblings, two separate eggs and two separate sperm. They just get inseminated at the same time. So fraternal twins only have a 9 to 17%, somewhere in that range, of both of them simultaneously developing schizophrenia. And your identical twins is where you have one sperm and one egg, but it splits into two embryos. So it's monozygotic, but it is two separate embryos that develop. And that's why they have an identical genetic makeup, because it's the same sperm and the same egg that they just split in half. So they share the exact same genotype, and generally, if you're born at the same time as your sibling, you're going to share the same environment. So you're going to be sort of growing up together. You're going to have the same parents, live in the same house. That's what same environment means. And if this was closer to 100%, so if one of the twins developed schizophrenia and we measured populations of them and we found that in every single case, the other twin also then developed schizophrenia within their lifetime, we would think that schizophrenia is purely genetic. It is purely based on what you are born with, but it's not. It's somewhere in the range of 40 to 50%. So we know that environmental factors are certainly contributing to developing the syndrome. Okay, so the third point we'll look at is adoption studies. So getting a bit more into this nature versus nurture. So if you guys don't know, nature is the idea of what you are born with. It is just your genetic makeup. It's what you are, what nature intended for you, I guess. And nurture is how you are raised. So it's a makeup of all the environmental stimuli you're exposed to during your upbringing. It's largely down to like your parents and that kind of thing. And the adoption studies were just trying to split that nature from the nurture. So what they did was they looked at high-risk children that were separated from their schizophrenic parents to test if basically schizophrenic parents were offloading some kind of social cues or something in the development stage that was causing a higher risk of their offspring to develop schizophrenia. So we have this study from 1966 where 47 children were separated from their schizophrenic mothers. So the mothers had to be institutionalized to manage their condition. And 47 of their children were adopted, and they were actually permanently separated from their mothers. Not for the study, it was just that these children happened to be separated from their mothers just because the mothers couldn't couldn't look after the kids, and so the study just followed these kids around. And they tracked down all these kids, and when they reached their 30s, they did a follow-up. So the reason that these studies tend to do like a 30-year follow-up is that I believe the peak incidence of schizophrenia in males is like late teens to early 20s for males, and like late 20s to early 30s for women. So tracking them down in their 30s, it's not the most rigorous methodology, because you can develop schizophrenia at any point in your life. It's just that they kind of wanted to be like, when's the peak incidence? And that way we'll try to collect as much information on these kids. And if they were going to develop schizophrenia, they probably would have developed it by now. And they found that 10% of that group of 47 children with schizophrenic mothers did develop schizophrenia. So what that means is that there is a 10-fold increase chance compared to the general population. And then they compared that to a control group of 50 orphans who didn't have schizophrenic parents, and none of those developed it by the time of their 30s. Doesn't mean a whole lot. With a bigger sample size, in the thousands, you would expect this 0% to be closer to like 1%. Just don't really have a big enough sample size for that. And yeah, but we can see from the adoption studies, the main takeaway is that the genetic component is still strong despite removing the nurture. So despite removing the schizophrenic mothers and their nurture component from the offspring. All right. And then the final part we're going to look at is the high-risk studies. So this was a little bit bigger sample sizes, and it was a little bit more recently. But it's where they took a sample of 207 children that were high risk because their parents had their mothers had chronic schizophrenia. And then they compared that to a low risk group who just had healthy parents. So 104 controls. Again, the follow-up was when they were in their sort of 30s. In the high risk group, you had 6% were diagnosed with schizophrenia with relatively high suicide rate. And in the low risk group, you had basically bang on average, 1% were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then they also looked in detail about these 13 people that were diagnosed with schizophrenia, just to get some more trends from them. They realized that for the most part, their parents were hospitalized when they're young. So there was, I guess, like an early separation from their parents. As youngsters, they were domineering, unmanageable, and aggressive. So they had personality traits that they tended towards. The word association test, they drifted away from the stimulus, and 70% of them had complications during birth, such as oxygen deprivation and premature birth. So some interesting, like common feature of birth problems with people who eventually develop schizophrenia. All right, and then we're going to look at some environmental factors of schizophrenia. I'm going to launch the second poll now. So the question is, which of the following is least likely to cause schizophrenia based on current research or just based on the lecture / my tutorial slides? So we haven't quite got into all of these yet. I'm just throwing this out there so you guys can have a crack at answering it yourself, and then we go through the answer together. Least likely to cause schizophrenia based on current research. It's a bit of a trick question. About 64% of you voted. I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds. All right, I feel bad because this was a trick question, but 74% of you thought there was influenza infection. Let me get this away. The correct answer is actually diminished dopamine activity in the brain. Guys, low dopamine activity is associated with Parkinson's. High dopamine activity is schizophrenia. So it was actually the third option. Influenza infection, yeah, absolutely. Some viruses are associated with schizophrenia. Another one is rubella. I'm waiting for the influenza drop. Yeah, 74%. Yeah, but trick question. I know it doesn't seem like it is related. I'm pretty sure it wasn't a lecture, but we're going to cover it in a minute anyway. I feel bad that was a trick question. But definitely, yeah, diminished dopamine activity in the brain. No, not associated with schizophrenia. it is in fact the opposite. High dopamine activity is what is associated with it. So I'm going to stop share. Go back to this. All right, moving on. So this is all your answers. So poor maternal nutrition, difficulties in pregnancy, and environmental stresses throughout life, as well as drug use and abuse. So those are all like, broadly speaking, your like environmental risks for schizophrenia. Then we have your biochemical ones. So this is where we introduce your dopamine hypothesis and your glutamate hypothesis. So dopamine hypothesis is that excessive activation of dopamine receptors is what causes schizophrenia-like symptoms. So getting too many messages in the central nervous system is what is going to cause schizophrenic-like symptoms. And to be fair, look, we only covered it really briefly in diffuse modulatory systems, where I like probably just briefly mentioned that too low dopamine activity is what gives you movement disorders like Parkinsonian-like symptoms, and too much dopamine is what gives you schizophrenia-like symptoms. And then your glutamate hypothesis is that diminished NMDA receptors in the brain are also somewhat responsible for schizophrenia-like symptoms. So you have two neurotransmitters that are implicated in schizophrenia. Glutamate, by the way, so NMDA is one of your glutamate receptors, and glutamate is a powerful excitatory neurotransmitter. So having too little of glutamate activation of NMDA receptors is implicated in schizophrenia. And just for FYI, AMPA and kainate are two of your other glutamate receptors. So you have NMDA, AMPA, and kainate. Yeah, I'd remember that. It's been a past question. I do like to throw that in there. All right, and the final one, viral. So viral infection, influenza and rubella have been implicated in schizophrenia. Just the last one that we're going to cover. So moving on to positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. I think this is my last poll, guys. Yeah. All right, it's up. So reading the question, what are some features of negative symptoms of schizophrenia? Pick as many as apply. So it's multiple choice, guys. You can pick all of them. You can pick just one. But I'm pretty interested to see what you guys remember from your negative symptoms. They were definitely in the lecture. To give you guys a little bit of time to do that. Negative symptoms, I'll give you a free one. So negative symptoms are your behavioral deficits. It's kind of an easy way to remember it. Deficits is like missing something. Negative is like missing something. And so behavioral deficits are like diminished emotional expression. Reduced affect is another one. And then you also have your two different types of schizophrenia. It's another thing that we sometimes throw in there. So your positive symptoms are type 1, they're characteristic of type 1, and your negative symptoms are characteristic of type 2. All right, we almost got 70% of you voted, so I'm going to end it there. Share results. Let me do this one more time. All right, so we had, I'll tell you the only one that wasn't true. So delusions of grandeur is not a negative symptom, it's a positive symptom. And the way to remember this is that, having a delusion is a presence of something. It's an exaggeration of something. So that's what makes it a positive symptom.
Oh, it's the grandeur that makes it the positive symptom. They have delusions of positive things.
Yep.
So they'll get really highly active, go on shopping sprees, spend, and do all those types of things that you would also see in some of those depressive disorders, Lou.
All right, but good job, guys. That's the last of the polls. So I'm gonna hide that. Cool, and then here's the answers. So positive symptoms are your behavioral excesses. They're characteristic of type 1 schizophrenia, and they're likely caused by dopamine excess. So we believe that positive symptoms are more so caused, they more so have a chemical basis. So this is really important, guys, because a chemical basis is something that we, I guess we're pretty good, like relatively, we're pretty good at treating it. It's something that we at least know that we can treat. Like, for example, if we give someone L-DOPA, which is a precursor to dopamine, we know that that is a way of increasing dopamine activity in the central nervous system, and that can fix the sort of, what am I trying to say here? Oh, sorry, we can target, sorry, I'm confusing you. We want to treat the overactivation of dopamine, but that is something, like a chemical basis is something we can treat compared to something like a physical or a physiological disturbance, like for example, these enlarged ventricles and cortical atrophy. That's something a lot harder to deal with because it's not a chemical imbalance. It's literally like physical components of your brain that are damaged or they've atrophied or something like that. But we associate these anatomical problems more so with the negative symptoms. And that's why we consider them a little bit trickier to deal with.
So look, I might give an example at this stage of what it may sound like, the positive symptoms and getting excessive behavioral activity in a situation like that.
Yeah,
I'm actually quoting from Psychology, Themes and Variations by Wheaton, W-E-I-T-E-N, of a psychiatric patient in one of the psychiatric facilities. And this is how she puts it. So Mick Jagger wants to marry me. If I have Mick Jagger, I don't have to covet Geraldo Rivera. Mick Jagger is Saint Nicholas, and the Maharishi is Santa Claus. I want to form a gospel rock group called the Thorn Oil, but Geraldo wants me to be the music critic on Eyewitness News. So what can I do? And it goes on and on. So this is just a real example of a quote of how a person actually starts to show erratic behavior, erratic thoughts, and have erratic verbal communication with people in a situation such as schizophrenia. It's actually quite a saddening situation. Having dealt with people at the hospital where I used to work with, used to come in with schizophrenia, it's not very nice at all. And yes, it's an area of research that is still underway and will be for a very long time, I think, including many other neurodegenerative type of disorders and so forth. But I just thought I'd give you a bit of an example like that, just to give you an idea of what it can be like and what it feels like to the person, or what it sounds like to somebody who might be listening in. Thanks again, Luke.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
All right. And yeah, just going into like examples of like what actually are the positive and negative symptoms. So we're going to categorize some of them and list and describe some of the different types of schizophrenia. So you do, as I mentioned at the start, you have subtypes of schizophrenia, and it can be helpful to get that subclass diagnosis because schizophrenia is quite nuanced, and knowing what symptoms are more relevant on like a patient-to-patient basis can be really helpful in terms of treatment. So positive symptoms, you can have delusions, like delusions of grandeur. When there is a preoccupation with delusions around a theme, or like feeling like you're being persecuted or chased by an imaginary adversary, like someone's out to get you, that's known as paranoid schizophrenia. And it's in the name, so it should be relatively easy for you to remember. And that can cause quite extreme behaviors where they're calling the police regularly, or they're maybe like barricading the door or something. But it's a very, very real scenario for them. You can have hallucinations, like a belief in supernatural forces. Disorganized speech and behavior are common, like rhyming talk. And in those cases where you have the disorganized speech or behavior, it's known as disorganized schizophrenia. So that's another one of your subtypes. An agitated movement is also an example of positive symptoms. Then we have your negative symptoms. So this is where, yeah, your behavioral deficits basically, and they're characteristic of type 2 schizophrenia, if you wanted to characterize it that way. So it's like reduced emotional expression and affect. Affect is your ability to react with an appropriate level of emotion to an event. So
having a reduced affect means that you might blow up over just like spilling a glass of water or something. You can't respond to it with just the appropriate level. You have an incredible overreaction or like an incredible underreaction to the event. That's also characteristic of disorganized schizophrenia. Other symptoms are difficulty in goal-directed behavior, which can lead to a lack of or like ignoring personal hygiene. And your last like subclass we look at is catatonic schizophrenia, and that is the most heavily associated with negative symptoms, including involuntary movements, like spasms, bizarre posture, grimacing, and repetition of words or phrases. And then you can have a final one, which is just like undifferentiated or uncharacterized schizophrenia. It's where it might have bits and pieces from the other ones. Like you might have a little bit of paranoid schizophrenia, a little bit of catatonic schizophrenia, but not a predominance of one of them. That's where you might call it like undifferentiated schizophrenia. Then we're going to look more heavily at the neuroanatomical correlates, which is a fancy word for like what actual parts of the brain are affected that we know of so far. So there's quite a few. We're going to go through a couple of them in like heavy detail, but this is the full list. So far we've just looked at like psychological manifestations like disorganized thought that are characteristic of schizophrenia. But these are your anatomical ones. So the frontal lobe is smaller in a person with schizophrenia, and it has reduced blood flow. So they have frontal hyperperfusion, which I believe is more accurately referring to when there's like reduced oxygen. That's what hyperperfusion is. But if you have reduced blood flow, you're getting reduced oxygen delivery anyway. So it's pretty much the same thing. Non-progressive cerebral ventricular dilation is, that's what first led to the proposal that schizophrenia was a neurodevelopmental disorder. And thinner parahippocampal gyri and abnormal dendritic fields in the dorsal prefrontal regions and hippocampus. So because you have abnormalities in the hippocampus, which is associated with memory, you then have these memory distortions. And another really important thing that's associated with that is this second last point. So the orientation of these neurons in the hippocampus, known as pyramidal neurons, they're really disorganized. I'm going to show you in a second exactly what they look like. But you've got two dot points here that are related to the hippocampus that are physical like differences in a schizophrenic brain that are causing memory impairments. And the last point is just enlarged lateral ventricles and thinner cortex in the medial temporal regions. All right, so these are your pyramidal neurons. On the left here, in A, you can see a healthy brain, and these pyramidal neurons, they kind of look like pyramids. They're almost like heart-shaped kind of cells. And they, in a healthy brain, they kind of run in like parallel lines, like kind of neat columns. And in the diagram on the right, you can see like a example of someone with schizophrenia. So the pyramidal neurons are highly disorganized. They're not forming these neat rows. They seem to be kind of turned at angles and kind of all over the place. So that is one of the implications for contributing to warped memories in schizophrenia, and it may lend to or even like contribute to the like paranoia or the delusions that they can experience. And they fully believe the person with schizophrenia that's having delusions is fully committed to them. So they lack sort of the ability to just be like, oh, I'm just seeing things, I'm just imagining things. It is a complete belief for them that what they're experiencing is real. So it's really important that they get that they manage their condition and they get some help. This is looking at, so the ventricles. So on the left is a MRI of a healthy and their identical twin that was diagnosed with schizophrenia is on the right, so that's their MRI. Remember that only 50% of identical twins, if one of them develops it, there's only a 50% chance that the other one will also develop it. So I think they were just pretty sure when they took these MRIs that one of them definitely was showing symptoms and the other one was fine. So the one on the left is your healthy ventricles. You can see they're just regularly sized. and they are enlarged in the MRI on the right, indicating a thinning of the cortex, which is characteristic in schizophrenia.
So what's happening there is actually the brain cells are dying. And previously, Luke mentioned the pyramidal neurons. Those neurons are the ones that actually sit fairly close to the cortex as well. And when they actually get haphazard type of arrangement, the synaptic transmission once again is affected, and it leads to all those behavioral deficits actually that you see in schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
So these are some of the neuroanatomical aspects of schizophrenia, an area that you would probably want to remember for your assessment purposes.
Yeah, definitely. All right, final slide, guys. Done well. So we're just looking at some treatments for schizophrenia. So the main target is going to be that chemical basis I was talking about. So it's I guess more straightforward to treat things that we believe have a chemical basis, like those positive symptoms. So the first one is targeting your dopamine receptors. So we want to block them, and specifically targeting D2 receptors. We believe that overactivity of dopamine is causing schizophrenic-like symptoms. So if we block those receptors with antipsychotics, then we are going to hopefully reduce some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. That's just the gist of it. They require several weeks to control the symptoms, these antipsychotics. Most patients will require maintenance for years, and relapse is common even while on treatment. Side effects can include movement disorders. So the idea of that is because, as I've said, too little dopamine, Parkinson's, too much schizophrenia. So if you have schizophrenia and you're taking treatment to try to lower your dopamine activity, it can go too far the other way, and you end up with movement-like disorders like Parkinson's. And we can refer to them as Parkinsonian-like symptoms. Other side effects include dry mouth, blurred vision, constipation, postural hypertension, and sedation. And newer drugs like clozapine and risperidone are attempting to remove some of those side effects, or at least make them a little bit. We just had a question from Mark. I'm going to go back to, are these adult brains? I believe they're not. I believe they are quite young. What would the one on the right look like when young? Like when they didn't have schizophrenia? Sarah just mentioned that they would probably be proportionately different, as there was major genetic implication here, and not all environmental based, as would be progressive as one transitions into being an adult.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to say here, Luke, is that because it's genetic based here mainly, and yet they are young ones at the moment, this thing should be proportionately growing in a similar manner as they grow into adults. So you would still see the right one being bigger when they became adults, and it's still bigger when they were younger. Later on, there can be that environmental influence, which could change the proportionate of these ventricle sizes a little bit. But I still think there's a strong genetic influence in this particular case, and it would continue to show it in a similar way, whether you were younger or older.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree, definitely. All right, and just finishing off here, guys. So drug research is exploring NMDA receptors. So that's just the other like chemical hypothesis that we have. So it's that too little NMDA receptor activation by glutamate is the cause for schizophrenia-like symptoms. So it's too much dopamine and too little NMDA activity. Just got to remember those two. And so drug research is looking to increase NMDA receptor responsiveness, or its sensitivity, basically, and even combining dopamine receptor blockers with NMDA receptor antagonists is another way that we might try to reduce symptoms. So using a little bit of both could be quite helpful. Okay, that is your tutorial on schizophrenia. As usual, I'm just going to be, me and Sarah are going to be here for another 5 minutes, just in case you guys have any more questions related to the tutorial or otherwise. Sarah, if you've got any closing remarks.
Yes, I do. This is an interesting topic. It follows on from the mental illness topics that we've already covered, like Luke said, but it just stays in a realm of its own. Schizophrenia is a very big area of, well, a mental state, as well as a big area of research and teaching, you could say. Something that will go on for a while yet, I think, in the area of neurosciences. But just to let you all know, the final exam, your anatomy exam is coming up. We've put out online announcement of what the exam will entail. It is a timed exam online. Similarly, I have decided that the final exam will be a timed LMS exam online, and it will be, again, based on multiple choice questions. There won't be any short or long answer type questions for the final exam either at this stage. But I will make more announcements about the final exam later on. Thanks,
Okay.
Lou.
Cool. Great. All right, guys. Thanks for that. I'm going to say goodbye to all of you now. Again, yeah, if you want to ask any questions, feel free to. I'm going to be here for another 5 minutes. Other than that, thanks for coming, guys. Enjoy your weekend. I'm going to see you guys next week for our final tutorial together. And yeah, thanks for coming, guys. See you later.
I have a question.
Go right ahead, Mark. Both Luke and I are listening. Yep.
Yeah, go for it.
Thanks. So back to the ventricle size, is that something that's apparent well before they're diagnosed with schizophrenia? Is that the point of that slide?
I'm interested in that too, Sarah, because I don't think it would be. I am thinking...
Depending on when the image is taken. And nowadays, obviously, there's infants and then the MRIs and all that is an issue when they're born. Of course, there's ethical implications as well of subjecting them to the X-rays and the MRIs and so forth. But it would be quite prominent if it's genetic. However, once again, just say if it was not genetically inclined, it was something that was going to be due to environmental factors that would be happening a little bit later in life, because environmental factors don't necessarily kick in when you're young. Having said that, I should point out, like Luke did, there could be problems during birth. There could be problems during pregnancy. There could be issues of compromised pregnancy, etc. So the issues of schizophrenia can start early, but I don't think it will be as prominent as one that is genetically inclined right from the beginning. And I also think that something that's environmentally affected would develop further as time goes on and you grow into adulthood. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of like with autism. That was my project topic, and one of the ways that they study people is they figure out people who are at high risk. I think it's if an older sibling has autism, then I forget the percentage, but I think it's about 20% chance of the next or one of the following kids developing it. So they can start studying these people, the high-risk people at an early age, do scans and get data, and then wait and see if they develop autism or not. I guess if or not, they just disregard the data they've collected. But if they go on to have autism, then they have some good early data on them. Just found that pretty interesting.
They do resort to a lot of high-risk studies nowadays as well, Mark, in the area of neurodegenerative disorders, schizophrenia, mental disorders, and so forth, so they can have a progressive follow-up of what type of environmental factors can actually lead to some of these disease states later in life. But you're right, yes. There is such a big overlap in this area, and even ADHD, I'm sure you've heard of that as well. Yeah. So it's a big area of research, and it's really fascinating. What I can say is we still have not necessarily gotten the full grasp of each different type of mental disorder. whether it's environmentally influenced or whether it's a genetic thing, we're still at it. Yes, there's treatments, etc. available, but research still goes on to perfect it and make it better.
Yeah, totally. I feel like autism, they're really just scratching the surface. They don't really know.
Very much so. They, like researchers in the unit also talk about ADHD, had an honor student who actually looked into that. Yeah, even that scratches the surface. I still feel we don't know much about a lot of things in the area of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Generally, as a whole, science is a really hype topic, and I think it will go on for a little longer than we anticipate. And I'm hoping it will go on forever. And we will always be finding new things. Look, the human body is fascinating, and I've always been fascinated in the area of neurosciences, and I'm hoping that Luke can say the same.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't.
I guess we may even find new diseases or disorders eventually. I mean, the way things like autism supposedly is increasing in prevalence in society.
I think it'll be a matter of categorizing them a bit better.
Yes, I think so.
That's another thing I found with autism was the categorization, the umbrella term for like the common ones are like classic autism and Asperger's disorder. And to me, they're like totally different things, even though they have the social impairment in common. Seems like putting them in one category and then trying to, especially when a lot of studies, and I didn't really have time to talk about this in the presentation, but a lot of studies, they don't distinguish between the different subtypes of autism. They just say, we had 54 studies, 54 participants, subjects with ASD, and they someone who's highly intelligent with Asperger's compared to someone who has a high degree of mental disability. I mean, they're totally different things, I would have thought.
There could be similar underlying biological basis, as you would know of the different types of mental disorders. I mean, when you think about depression and anxiety, so many manifestations of those disorders are similar. And you would think, oh, it's the same one and the same thing. But the biological basis is different. But at the end of the day, the HPA-X is implicated in both. And depression gets you into a different type of behavioral state. Anxiety gets you into a slightly different type of behavioral state. The physiological manifestations are also different, sometimes similar. So there's an overlap as well as there's a difference. And yes, we have categorized our different mental disorders in the area of anxiety disorders and affective disorders a little bit better than some of the more peripheral ones that are still yet to be discerned and yet to be identified and categorized better, I think. Mark, you're right. Well, there you are. You found yourself an area for research, I'm hoping. But that was very interesting conversation.
Neuroscientist.
Well, I think being a neuroscientist is an exciting area to be in, I think, personally. But that was a nice question. Yes, so it opens up the area of neurosciences in a big way, I think. There is much yet to be known and much yet to be learned.
Yep, totally. Well, thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
All right, anytime.
Cheers.
And Sarah, we have another question just in the chat regarding the online anatomy tutorials and the prac exam.
So as I read it, start answering it, Luke.
Oh, okay. In regard to targeting study for the practical exam, it was mentioned that content presented in the online anatomy tutorials will be assessed. Is this only the anatomical components of these online tutorials or the physiological components as well? I'm just trying to understand. So anatomical components is like the labeling of the diagrams, I think.
Yes, so
that's kind of what I was getting at, as opposed to like what we've pretty much been talking about for this tutorial.
Yeah.
Yes, so the anatomy exam is based mainly on the material that we're teaching you in the anatomy practical labs, which is the face-to-face practical labs. At the same time, having said that, we've also got anatomy video material, Eklund's supporting material for anatomy online as well. So if people are unable to attend the lab, they can be learning from that as well. Majority of the questions in the anatomy exam is based on anatomy. That's the whole purpose here. An occasional physiological one may creep in together with the anatomy, but it's mainly anatomical. However, you should know your physiological basis and your underlying understanding of the physiology to be able to answer some of those questions anyway, because it could be asked in a manner that may have a physiological question asking you which anatomical component is this linked to. So it would be good to know it as a general, but mainly on your anatomical components, that I can say, without revealing too much.
Yeah, no, that's great, because I've been doing those ACLA videos and revising what we've done in the face-to-face labs, but I just wasn't sure how much review we should be doing of these online tutorials at the moment. Obviously, heading into the final exam, pretty much
Yes.
everything's,
Heading into the final exam, everything is important, the physiology as well as the anatomy. But at this particular point in time, what we are trying to say is, if you're learning from those anatomy face-to-face practical labs, as well as from the material placed online for the anatomy tutorials and video quizzes, etc., you should be fairly covered for the anatomy exam. That said, I would not negate you knowing your physiological components as well, if you can, for this particular exam as well.
Yep, too easy. Thanks for that.
All right.
No
Good luck with the exams.
I think that's everyone, Sarah. Yeah, it's just you and me.
So Luke, I think that went really well. Thank you very much for that. And we'll catch up again next week.
Yes, will do.
Thank you, Luke.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye-bye.
See you. Bye.